So Bruchim Habaim, welcome to Mishkan Shalom's Lunch, Live, and Learn series. Rabbi Shawn Zevit here. We did the formalities, but we're going to record the first part where we'll have more of a discussion, a dialogue, David and I, and then we won't record the further conversation according to each of your desires when we move forward from that, so that you can feel the combination of us. The goal of the series is to also be able to record and then share in our larger Mishkan Shalom community the series of subject matters that we cover here, so that we have the farthest reach moving forward. And we also want to balance that with informal sharing of whatever nature you want that's just for us here, since you all paid the big tickets and oh my gosh, I just got so thirsty, Jackie. I don't know what you're drinking, but it looks good to me. So just be mindful, right? You could have a virtual background, San Francisco, like the aesthetics of our little squares go a long way as well. So delightful to see the cosmic backgrounds that comprise all 20 of us that are here today. So Ashrei, with gratitude we are gathered. And I want to begin a reading before introducing David, who doesn't need so much of an introduction, it's just a welcoming, from an excerpt from the Kol Shalom newsletter and the article that I wrote for that, which I know many of you have read 3 or 4 times over at this point. I'm going to put some nusach to it so we can chant it in a service as well. And I'm reading my words because maybe you missed them. Hopefully you got to the words especially of our young people, both Isaiah Weeks' confirmation speech and Joel Simon's Devar Torah that he wrote and that he rewrote 3 times for his bar mitzvah, including the week before, because for him, he felt he couldn't come to his bar mitzvah not addressing Black Lives Matter and anti-racism issues. He felt he wouldn't have integrity if he only stuck with the meaning of the Parsha and the pandemic. I remember one night watching Stephen Colbert, and he said, "Do you remember nostalgically the days when it was just the pandemic that was filling all the headlines? Wasn't that like 3 weeks ago?" So, the times we're living in are changing almost rapidly as the technology. So for those of us who benefit from being white, and the majority of Ashkenazi heritage Jews are considered white in the United States and North America, so we benefit from this, those of us that fall in that category, regardless of how we see ourselves. A curtain of complacency or illusion of equity has been torn down. The oppression and the ensuing responses, or lack thereof, are and will be televised. We speak the names of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Sean Reed, Tony McDade, Jameek Lowry, on and on, as each of the lives of these Black American men and women have been erased in public murder or in the safety of their own homes. Another unique soul has been torn from the fabric of the world by officers and individuals informed by white privilege and white supremacy. The Babylonian Talmud in Shabbat 54b states, "Whoever can protest for their household and does not is accountable. If they can protest to their townspeople and do not, they are accountable. If they can protest to the whole world, they are accountable for the whole world." And at the same time, Hillel would say, before you make yourself ground into anxiety and stasis as a result of that statement, it's not up to each of us to complete the task, nor are we free to desist from it. And if not now, when? And if not me, who? But protest will look different, or action for each of us. This is not a time, especially in the middle of a pandemic, to judge or assess each other on what the form of protest or action looks like uniformly. Some of us with underlying conditions or who are responsible for young ones and our elders need to find other forms of involvement or become activated in different ways than we might have been used to before. Those of us who are used to taking the lead might need to witness and support our young leaders or people of color up front. And I'd like to share the words of one of our members, David Love. Oh, what a nice coincidence. It's so great that you're our guest here today. A journalist and himself African-American man married to a white Jewish woman and father of 2 Black Jewish children. This is a time of tremendous fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, but also of possibilities and transformation. On the one hand, I feel as if we are in the last days of the Weimar Republic in Germany in 1933. On the other hand, we are witnessing an awakening, a movement for justice we haven't seen in the nation before. George Floyd was a catalyst, but this is about something more than Floyd, and even more than police violence. We see multiracial coalitions and class solidarity building. We also see a frightening government response, blatant authoritarianism, and brute force to stop this new movement for justice. This moment in time reflects years of failing to come to terms with racial injustice. But now that so many eyes are opening up, I believe, David goes on to say, it is a prime opportunity to confront Dr. King's evil triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. Black people always were and always will be on the front lines of this struggle, but I think it is time for white people to take the lead and reach their own white brothers and sisters. Black people have been the focal point of police violence, but it is clear that they will not remain the only targets of violence. The Jewish community can relate to this. And I'm reminded of the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller and his poem, First They Came, which dealt with his criticism of the cowardice of German intellectuals and clergy for not speaking up during the rise of Hitler. I'm also reminded of King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he took the moderate white clergy to task for preferring order to justice and wanting the civil rights movement to wait until a more convenient time to fight for freedom. I think this is a time to put our ideals to work. It is time to deal with white privilege and white supremacy and racism, but also the way society wages economic and social violence against people. Even as we are socially distant and organized simultaneously, we will need each other more than ever. I'm reminded also, David, recently of a white clergy caucus through Faith in Action nationally, of which we're a member of Power, is our statewide version of that. That myself and Reverend Abby Tennis called at the behest of the leading Black clergy nationally, so that we would be doing our parallel work and not concocting what the action should be, because that's, we're following the lead of our Black brothers and sisters there, but what is the specific work? And even the subset that I then called within white Jewish clergy. We don't have any clergy of color in Philadelphia yet, but to do our separate work, to be able to discuss the Jewish and white nuance of that particular work. And Reverend Tennis said very powerfully at that conversation, when people talked about the pandemic, and she said, well, that's all fine. But when I made the announcement asking people to either join the actions or on the streets or help behind the scenes, the only responses I got from white clergy were why they couldn't make the marches. And she said, did no one hear my invitation to also be behind the scenes and send emails out and make phone calls? What does leadership mean? So that piece resonated for me, having heard your words. So as to complete this opening piece, as Rabbi Yael and I both mentioned in the newsletter, listen and pay attention. Lift up the ideals and the visions we long for. We are here together and we need each other. Keep justice and love, the sacred, at the center in this time of ongoing shattering, unrest, and uncertainty. For we as a people, as we have many times before, look to one another for support and wisdom, to our Jewish and other traditions for guidance. We are here, we need to be here with and for each other. And I've changed that we were made for these times to we are being made anew in these times. This firewalk is forging us into something else. I personally don't want to go back to normal, even when a vaccine comes, because a normal has all these embedded institutional inequities with it and planetary disregard. So I'd like to go towards a new horizon as opposed to back towards something. As our tradition says, every time we finish one of the books in the Torah, that we chant Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek. Let us be strong in power and empower each other. So, at the same time, none of us is one note or one narrative. It's something I so love about the declaration of Shema Yisrael. Here we are all wrestling, trying to find meaning and purpose of life, and we are all one. But you don't get to that oneness unless you acknowledge the totality of a person and all of life's stories. In some of the conversations I've had, particularly with Black clergy colleagues, I learned very quickly that I needed to back off of discussing the issues, because one colleague wanted to talk, his first question was, how are you handling marriage and being there for the kids at these times? Because I really want to talk about that. And the other clergy person I talked to said, can we talk a bit about finances? Do you have what financial guidance are you getting right now? Because my church is on the ropes and I'm not sure how I'm going to manage my personal finances. And it's like, well, being for each other in these times means being open to whatever the issues are that someone wants to discuss or not be part of that discussion in that moment in time. So David Love, welcome to us. You've got a lot of love in your name. I don't know what the A stands for, but David means beloved in Hebrew, and your last name is Love, and then you are a love. So I guess that all puts things together for us today. So please, I want to start by just you telling everybody a little bit of your background, whatever it is that you want to introduce yourself, and the journey that's brought you to Mishkan. Let's start there.
Yes. Well, Rabbi Shawn, or should I say Bishop Shawn, in relation to our earlier conversation. I should mention my middle name is Andrew, but thank you very much for having me, and hello to everyone. It is great to see you. If you had told me a year ago, or even several months ago, that all of us would be having regular Zoom conferences, I would have said, what do you mean? But here we are nonetheless, and I think it's good that we are still maintaining a sense of community. I have been a member of Mishkan for, believe it or not, 15 years. In 2005, my wife Sarah and I had gotten engaged. We had just gotten out of law school 2 years earlier, and we had decided from the beginning that we wanted to have a Jewish household and raise Jewish kids. So we started looking around for a community to be a part of, and Mishkan was our choice, and we were very happy about that choice. Because we wanted a place where we felt comfortable, and we both had a strong sense of justice. In law school, we were social justice, public interest oriented people, and we shared that sense of justice, which is a very Jewish thing. And we wanted to maintain that in our professional, personal, and spiritual lives. And I felt very comfortable being a part of the Mishkan community because I didn't have to justify myself, prove myself, or, check the boxes in terms of my validity or explain myself. In some Jewish spaces, there is that sense of the need for you to explain yourself and your circumstances. Are you Jewish? Are you really Jewish? Were you born Jewish? Did you convert? all of those things, and the fact that I didn't have to, really explain all of that, and also the fact that it's a place where my children feel welcome and at home, not as if they or we are being tolerated, but that we're actually part of a community. So that was my introduction to Mishkan and also to uh, Judaism and the Jewish community. Although I should also say that I grew up in an area in New York, in Queens, that was heavily Black and Jewish, and just about all of my friends growing up were Black or Jewish. And I had a mezuzah on my door at my house, and I almost feel as if it was fate. I didn't know it at the time, but winding up where I am now is sort of I think it was fate. um,
David, could you mention what in that fate? It would be interesting if you went back and found that mezuzah and if it said Sarah on it, meaning the portent of your partner to be on top of everything. But that piece from law school that you both shared, you and Sarah, and coming together as a multi-faith interracial couple in that regard, and your movement from the law piece to, I guess, more of journalism right now, even before Mishkan. Could you say something about that journey for you?
yes. Well, I should mention that my decision to pursue law was because of discrimination that I had experienced in corporate America in a former life, out of college, my first job, and I saw some pretty bad things, and it made me decide to shift gears. I decided, no, I was not going to become a corporate executive, and I became an activist, human rights activist. Uh, Decided to work in New York with victims of police brutality. This was back in the mid to late 90s. And also, as I was pursuing social justice, criminal justice, and eventually law, I was also writing about a lot of the issues that I was working on, the issues that interest me as far as social justice, human rights, um, race, politics, and those things. Um, so I was doing the social justice work, eventually law, but I was also doing journalism on the side. And then it came to a point where I just decided to do the journalism and the writing full time. Also teaching journalism at Temple and more recently at Rutgers.
Was that
So
because you saw in that possibility as someone committed to change and justice in your own life? There was something about the written word and that vocation that called to you more deeply?
mm, I would say yes. You know, I, I view myself as someone who uses all the tools at my disposal to get the word out. And when I was working in the nonprofit world, when I was working in government, uh, other spaces, I used whatever tools were at my disposal to try to spread uh, narratives, certain messages that were important to me. And um, I found that writing has been a very powerful tool for me personally, um, to speak about issues that I feel aren't covered as they should be, or maybe in the way that I feel they should be, but they aren't. And, I bring a particular perspective. And I think that uh, I feel that I'm fortunate to be able to craft these narratives and actually, have people read them and respond. So I guess ultimately, I do think that writing and journalism have become my primary tool, although I also think that teaching students, younger people, has been very worthwhile to try to, take my experience and my knowledge and find a way to help lead them along and benefit them. Because if we're not doing that, then what are we really doing?
Can you say something about a little bit more about that perspective? I mean, I've gotten to know you and sort of see, it wasn't a surprise for me in the words that you sent me that I included in my article, that you tapped onto King's legacy and, and didn't solely define the moment from a racial justice perspective, but economics and how we're in the global, interdependence in that way. And I know that that pivotal point of Ferguson and onwards also catapulted you into, the CNN and that whole universe of people tapping you for that. So what is it about that perspective that you bring that you could articulate to us to make sure that we know what it is you see your voice is about?
Hmm. Well, it's funny. I mean, not really funny, but it's interesting that I've been, well, for obvious reasons, I talk a lot about race, and I think that now many people are getting the point. They're getting the idea that this is something we need to talk about. Sort of the original sin, um, the foundation of the country based on slavery, the enslavement of Africans and genocide of indigenous people. But now it's even gone beyond that because I think the murder of George Floyd, uh, it was about police abuse, police brutality, but this also happened in the middle of the pandemic at a time when, you know, millions upon millions of Americans are also unemployed. And that doesn't even get into the ongoing climate crisis and other things. But we're at a point right now, I believe, where people are able to connect the dots between the racism, the police abuse, the systemic systems of oppression, and just the moment that we're in where so many people are suffering, not just in terms of racial injustice, but economic and social and so many others. And I believe it's a turning point. I think this time is different. I would like to think that it's going to lead to some substantial change. And I think that we're seeing that happen. But I think we're really now in a moment of history. And I am very happy to see that people are having conversations that they have never had before. It's not new. None of this is new. But I think that the awakening of many parts of the country, that is new. And I'm happy to see that.
And I remember in the late 80s and 90s, being introduced to some models of prejudice reduction in Canada through the National Coalition Building Institute, Sherry Brown's work. Actually, her number one person supporting her is now the head of Faith in Action nationally as well, African American clergy person. And at that time there was the work also tried to get those people in particular power or connected to institutional power, to see that the role of the oppressor, conscious or not, was actually as much of a prison as the oppressed in that regard, and to try to trigger enlightened self-interest. And I think that's a piece that I see, particularly the number of white folks involved, or even the revolution spreading to small town America, to the suburbs changing, in terms of their attitude, and people saying, like, this is about all of us. This is not, like I so appreciate you said in terms of Mishkan, it's not a nice thing to welcome everybody. I'm very leery. I understand the Jewish phrase, welcoming the stranger. That meant in biblical times the non-Israelite. But, who's doing the welcoming in that center, and who's being welcomed in? And if we're not all part of the we welcoming others in, then that itself is an unconscious bias, that we need to look at. And I was on a panel with Rabbi Mordechai Liebling, one of our members, and Rabbi Sandra Lawson, a Black rabbi from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, recently ordained. We were doing a training for 90 clergy students and faculty recently. And, the piece that Rabbi Sandra said directly, her experience was a little bit different. And she named that she had never been in a Jewish environment where the questions that you relayed before had not been asked of her. And Rabbi Mordechai said, did you all hear that? Rabbi Sandra has never been in a place that hasn't happened. So to avoid any of us going, oh, I'm triumphant, or I'm more enlightened or evolved, and then miss all the microaggressions that can also take place. So, I guess you're expressing a lot of hopefulness. Maybe I'm a little bit more wary because I want to see, what does everybody do after the march or after the petition, or what do we do as a community on an ongoing basis, all of the we that we are that way. So I'm wondering if you could say anything, and some people have started. I want to encourage now, if you have something, that you want to ask of David, or a comment you want to add, there's a little chat box down there. I'll do my best to capture that. But, when you think of the now, David, and particularly, both us at Mishkan, or in general, what might really be the tipping point, not only the headline, what are you sensing now is the place that could move the dial for real towards justice?
I think that the moment that we find ourselves right now wouldn't have taken place without coronavirus. It's a strange thing to say, but I believe that people being at home, anguished, in isolation, and able to reflect on what's going on in society has really made a difference in a curious sort of way. I think the next stage now, as we see ourselves in, this reality, is the economic devastation that so many people are facing. I think that's going to be a tipping point. I think that has been part of the mix, because you really can't separate the racism from the economic deprivation and the health crisis and all of the other things that we're coping with. So I believe that as we find ourselves in a society where the government and the political leadership isn't able to, or is unwilling to, solve the myriad problems we have, I believe that's going to be the tipping point. And I think the Jewish community is well suited for this call. Obviously, the legacy of caring about justice and being committed to justice. I think it also means that it requires people to really take a good look at our history, and to look at white privilege. And it's not an issue of shaming people, but I think it's an issue of just coming to terms with the past and the present. And I was just reminded of a monument in honor of Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State. And that's not to criticize the white Jewish community, but it's to say that's a part of history that we need to talk about. White supremacy is, anti-Semitism is part and parcel of white supremacy, but I think also the Jewish community needs to come to terms with how it has benefited from perceived whiteness in this society. And ultimately, people of color, Black people, are going to be on the front lines of this struggle. But ultimately, I think white people, white Jewish people, and others are going to have to really do the heavy lifting, because as you said earlier, the oppression is not just a matter of Black people, but it's also those who benefit from the oppression. I think it's also like a prison, and it's incumbent upon all of us to remove those shackles, because we're all really kept behind and we can't move forward because of all of these centuries-long obstacles that have been put in our place, in our way.
I wanted to respond to something from the Jewish community perspective, but again, I want to invite you, there's a little chat box below. If you have a comment or a question, something you want to put in for David, please don't hesitate to do so. I'm thinking even 2 or 3 years ago, David, what you just said in terms of your calling the Jewish community, particularly the white, part of the Jewish community to bear, would have been different, because one thing recent events have done is it's stirred up an examination within the Jewish community about where there is prejudice, what the institutions, including us at Mishkan or Jewish federations or camps, et cetera, have built in those dynamics, and the voice of Jews of color coming to the fore in the ways that I have never seen. And one could say, oh, now there's increasingly Jews or non-Jewish partners. I think of Odamas Fernandez Scheinboom, who's the director of our, not director, the chair of our education committee, and within our community, people who are not Jewish but raising Jewish kids, or people of color increasingly having roles. And at the same time, we were one of 400 organizations and synagogues that signed on a support for the Black Lives Matter movement recently that went public. And there was an interesting and, I was about to say controversial, but it's not so much controversial as an edge-pushing document that 3 Jewish Black leaders put together called Not Free to Desist, that obtained many signatures and now is starting to go viral. And, in that they talk about signing on to that commitment within the Jewish community, that within 1 year this, and 3 years and 5 years, and percentages of members or people in leadership roles. And they quickly had to qualify. The people said, oh my God, like, how are we going to do that here in rural St. Louis or whatever? And they said, no, this is not like you have to check that and I'm at 18%. This is about reaching for a goal and also raising up the barriers that might exist within Jewish life. And of course, as a people, we span many things. So if you land in the Middle East or in Balkan countries or other places, you're not going to find too many white Jews, in the way that we have fallen into that identity here. And at the same time, as you said, I see a willingness to open up to the baked in benefits of white privilege and also some of the biases that have been inherent, whether it's Benjamin, as you say, or other places. I think that's an actual sign of strength. That aspect that I grew up with where, oh my gosh, if there was a Bernie Madoff or whatever, all Jewish people would be implicated and we're all going to go down as a result of that poor behavior. Not that one would condone such behavior, but at the same time, I think we're in a different place of claiming a strength that says, even with signs, Jews or Blacks will not replace us, marching through streets, as we saw in Charlottesville. We don't have to come from that place of fear. We could also acknowledge the strength that we're in this particular society and use that, to affect change. So I think that there's a level of conversation even within the Jewish community. When I say within the Jewish community, I mean all of us who are within that framework, whether we're Jewish or not, that I haven't seen before. And it's a growing edge. I find myself just, in case people go, oh, we're both evolved past that, having to say I'm sorry and making more mistakes now than I am used to either falling into or perhaps now acknowledging, where my own biases or ignorances, even well-intentioned as some of them may be, have fallen, into under the trying to do good. And so I think that's a piece too that we certainly need to be careful of, that piece of white fragility, or, well, I tried and I wasn't received that well. Well, that's not the time for that right now. There will be time to look at those things. So we have a couple of comments here. Let's see. Madeline says, I think that as we stay home, we have time to reflect on the present and the future, on our vulnerability and responsibility. And Lisa Gales wonders, who she knows you, David, Lisa Gale, who's with us, and Rabbi Sandra. I know that asking in a Jewish space, how did you come to be here, has racial undertones and is an aggressive question. I wonder if gender plays a role, or what else, what else might have been a reason what else might have been reason why you didn't feel that at Mishkan. So, I know that Rabbi Sandra, who's married to another woman, who's, also a Black Jewish person and so on. I mean, she talks about all the different identity markers she's had to navigate. But I just wonder if you could, speak to that piece.
I'm sorry, speak to that piece as far as
the thing that Lisa Gale's wondering out loud about how gender plays into this mix, sexual orientation. We've talked about race, ethnicity, economics, etc., but there's these other points of navigation.
Yeah. Well,
and Jackie, by the way, says she didn't feel that at Mishkan, but in all other Jewish places she's been. Not to let us totally off the hook, but go ahead.
Well, I will say that the things that I haven't experienced at Mishkan, I have experienced in other settings where I was, questioned or held as suspect. And I guess that speaks to microaggressions. I mean, it's something as a Black man that I have been used to for my whole life, whether in Jewish spaces or just the greater community. And it's a lot. It's a lot. And I think, people experience it in different ways based on their gender, based on their sexual orientation and other issues. But I'm glad that it's all starting to come to the surface. And, you know, as a Black man with various identities, sometimes it's a lot. It's a lot to deal with. It's a lot to deal with. But I'm glad that people are finally starting to realize that we need to address it. I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but
Well, I appreciate you're not trying to answer all of it, because, you know, Sandra navigates, you know, a whole other, you know, series, you know, of issues as well. Abby goes on to say, I'm a bit uncomfortable with Mishkan exceptionalism. When we start talking about when we start talking about abolishing the police or reparations? And Abby, I wonder if you might, I suspect we're in for different conversations. So that's what Abby is, you know, offering this piece, that, you know, there's a place, you know, Lisa Gale's agreeing with what Abby was saying too. There's a place where, you know, we can be in a certain comfort zone. But when we talk about those other pieces, and I find it interesting being in relationship with, we haven't so much talked about the generations, because
This
some
is
of the,
Ellen talking.
oh, that was you, Ellen. Okay, thank you. Ellen Tishner, right, trying to fake being Abby Reuter.
Hijack Abby's.
That household, both of you represent that. I'm not surprised either one of you could have raised that question appropriately. That, you know, generationally, you know, working with some of the elder Black clergy and Black leaders in the city, sort of seeing the language and having a different arc of understanding than noticing some of the younger leaders. And, you know, I don't want to get ageism can play out there as well, but it's interesting, you know, for me getting, learning at the feet of some of the clergy people and seeing, well, if we're going for this, if this is our strategy, then language does matter. And if we may be talking about dismantling the police as we've known it, especially since in the United States, you know, reclaiming or capturing people who were actually freed, African Americans who were freed from slavery, and the formation of police forces for that nefarious reason, is a piece of history that we can't wash away here. And others are, well, we're talking about taking that funding and putting it towards Black and other impoverished or minority communities that's already in the system, as opposed to having nothing at all. And I don't know if you have any perspective on that, because as Ellen and Abby, I'm sure, you know, in raising that question, are saying we've got to be able to go there as well and face that discomfort, or be with the discomfort of certain things.
yes, a lot of discomfort, because, and I really didn't expect, you know, this year for us to, as a country or as a community, to talk about all of these issues as real possibilities. But I think it is going to cause many people to be uncomfortable when we're discussing, you know, possibly dismantling institutions that we have been used to for years, since day one. But we never really think about the origins of those institutions. So yeah, the police, you know, the criminal justice system, so many institutions that our society is built on. And I think also what's really great about this moment is that it's also global. So it will really challenge us to think about how we look at people around the world, how they look at us. It's also an opportunity for us to build bridges and form coalitions with people around the world. Last week, I was in a Zoom conference with an organization of human rights activists in India, working on issues of racism in India, and the issues that Muslims and Dalits experience in India. So it's an opportunity. I think there is a lot of there are a lot of opportunities for us to break bread with people around the world. It's also going to mean a lot more discomfort. But I think that discomfort, like giving birth, is going to be positive in the end.
I'm appreciating your underscoring that word. Rabbi Sandra lifted that up at the clergy gathering as well after she had shared her words. And she said, and now we're going to do a mindfulness sit with discomfort. And that was her major ask, was to not respond, react, give your version of, defend all the good things you're doing, but sit with any discomfort. Because as spiritual leaders, or as each of us leaders in our own particular realms, to be in relationship with that discomfort is a step towards that change. Because otherwise we react by doing too much or trying to, quote, save or take the leadership in moments where other people need to be brought to the fore to save the situation or fix it. I mean, tikkun olam, it's such a core principle, about that repair. And at the same time, as the doorbell rings and reminds me, it's just not only tikkun olam, it's tikkun hanefesh in our tradition, the care of the soul, acts of caring, as we say at Mishkan, as well as acts of justice and activism. And, my feeling is along this road that we need to care for each other as well. Not only like, how do we get to a certain goal, not getting to the goal at any cost. As a newer American citizen, I remember being with a If Not Now march for justice issues for Palestinians, as well as the environment downtown. And I was walking with one of our sages, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, and suddenly some of our younger leaders saw an opportunity to get into a space and have a sit-in and consciously get arrested. And there was that moment where, like, finally I can get arrested, as a citizen and not be worried I'm going to get thrown out of the country as a result of that when I apply. And there was Rabbi Arthur next to me. And so I faced that momentary change of, do I leave Arthur in the middle of the street in a crowd or race with everybody else there? And I wasn't going to leave him in that moment. And I had to accept, like, this is what I can do right now. It's not abandon somebody else in that movement for the larger principle. So they're not always easy changes. Maybe in another point, you and I might make a different decision based on that. So, I just wonder if you can say anything to navigating, not only sitting with the discomfort around facing institutionalized white supremacy or racism, but also sitting in the discomfort of the activism and those pivot points as we move through. I'm sure you've at least had one instance you've had to deal with that in your life.
Oh, yeah. I would say that we're in a situation now where we're called upon to do things that we didn't think were possible or necessary. A lot of the assumptions that we've had about what's important, some of those things have been thrown out the window to allow us to truly see what our priorities should be. And I think many people are acting on that. It's liberating. It's also potentially frightening. But I think when people are guided by what is truly important, then many things are possible, and it's not a single recipe or for everyone, but it depends on your individual circumstances. And I believe that people are understanding now. I think they're starting to understand what's really important. And it's people. People are important.
We're hearing a lot of that now. I think that aspect of there's no, I'm sitting this one out. I'm either anti-racist or I'm supporting racist structures.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, even if our action is a caring thing or getting groceries for somebody or reaching out to the neighbor in this moment in time, I'm sure familiar with you will love your neighbor as yourself. We say that in the first paragraph of the Shema. And the sages asked the question, what does it mean to love your neighbor? And they define that as, do you know the 5 to 7 households in the immediate vicinity of your home, and do you have a loving, connected relationship with them? And if we talk to them about who you are, would they say, I feel loved by my neighbor? And that's how they defined, can we claim to be loving our neighbor, as ourself? So I was particularly heartened that neighbors of mine just up the street called together a 4-block radius just this week to have an outside, socially distant, masked-on conversation about what will we do in our 4-block radius. Like the headlines are one thing, but what are our actions? And do we even know each other? Can we love each other, our neighbors as ourselves, if we don't even know who our neighbors are? And, as you know, that we both live in very diverse areas, socioeconomically, racially, religiously, and so on. So I think that's definitely part of it. And gratitude for your calm wisdom, says Madeline David. And Marie says, I think the fact that there are so many more blended families is part of why white America is more awakened than now before. And I would agree with that. And I will also say, having traveled the country, it depends where you are. Some of that blending may be, oh my gosh, a Protestant married a Catholic in our town. And that's the big, edge that's happened that way. It's not necessarily on the racial frontier that way. Just as we come in for a landing, Seth also asks, and I know I saw Billy Lindstedt, Goldsmith here, and Seth, both who have helped before the recent pandemic. We're helping revitalize our own green team at Mishkan. And Seth says, I wonder about your thoughts, David, on how the current focus of Black Lives Matter and racism will affect attitudes toward our collective responsibility for the climate crisis, which particularly even through Power, our network, is environmental justice, because the awareness of, even in Philadelphia, how people of color in particular, and where the geography is often more impacted by those climate shifts. But I wonder if you could, as we come in for a landing, say something about that issue, because as the pandemic has reminded us, everybody has equality under the pandemic and under the atmosphere's rules of engagement.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean,
Wait, let me qualify that. That's not true, because as we've seen, people of color and people with less resources do not have, it's not all equal. Let me just qualify that. But back over to you.
Yes. And the pandemic has exposed all of the inequalities, racial, economic, social, and otherwise. I've been saying that the coronavirus is really the dry run, the test run for climate change. And I've written a bit about climate apartheid and how the climate crisis is going to expose a whole host of inequality where low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities are going to be exposed to more of the ravages of the environment, disproportionately compared to other people. So really, I think that the planning, the talking, all of the action that we're taking now will help, further down the road when we have to deal with climate change. And I think it's all interrelated, and what we're dealing with now is just the beginning, because it potentially can get a lot worse.
David, thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock and going, didn't we just start the introductions? And here I can't believe the ground that's been covered in a short period of time. And one of the things that one of our members asked about with all these challenges is like, where's the place that we find hope? And so, as opposed to pretending that you and I have a PhD in hope, I just wanted to pass that question to everybody and to invite us all, collectively, just to take a moment in the chat box, if you're willing, and to say, where do you find hope in this moment? given all the challenges and more that we've discussed that way. Because, somebody talked about the groundswell that's taking place. We know that we have these issues and challenges. A lot of them are not new, but the big wake-up call, as you just mentioned, David. So, where are some places that you find hope? So if you could drop those in the chat, we'll just read those out so we create a little hope prayer as we come in for a close for today's conversation. And as we sit with that, I'm just going to chant Ashrei again for a moment to let us do this. The lunch and live part, the learning needs some digestion. So we'll give a moment of Ashrei here to let this sink in. Ashrei, I find hope in awareness and voices and passion of young people. Hope is in our individual willingness to take action and build those actions into the whole. The kids on TikTok gave me hope. I find hope in multiracial young people who peacefully took to the streets, a new generation of activists. Ashrei. In my wide Zoom social life, literally every white person is thinking about their own privilege in new ways. Keely says, thank you so much, David. I'm still thinking about what you said. A global movement. Ashrei, Yoshvei, Veitecha. Ashrei, Yoshvei, Veitecha. Hope is the willingness to face these truths without hiding from them, and knowing it's not only here in the US, but global challenges. The karmic fact that protests have not resulted in COVID spikes gives me hope. All of these things, from seeing the polls changing in recognition of the existence of racial injustice and white privilege. Oh, hallelujah, Selah. Oh, hallelujah, Selah. I bet you didn't know that was the original psalm, David. I don't know if you've ever heard that version chanted before. And as Mark says, in each celebrating each small step while knowing the large ones are required. So any closing words, David, that you want to offer? What it could be even what today has meant for you in reflection, or anything you want to say in closing.
Well, I have appreciated this time and this space just to talk and reflect on everything. And, as I had mentioned before, I think that now we're really starting to understand what's important. And I think that moments like this, that's what's really important to me. Just the community being able to talk without, any requirements, preconceptions, just able to talk frankly and openly about what's going on and trying to come up with ways to help each other.
Amen. Thank you so much. And there's been a treasure trove, a cornucopia of thank yous coming through the chat for you, David. I just wanted you to know that. And I wanted to close today, and we'll continue our series for the month of July on Thursdays from 12 to 1:15. I know your beloved Sarah is coming up in a couple of weeks, and Ali Michaels is going to circle in at some point. I joked, well, it wasn't really a joke. I told David beforehand that I was coming after the kids, that Micah and Eliana, their two little ones, would be guests at some point. And David said Eliana has a lot to say about most everything, and I'm sure she will be a great guest. We might give her like a year or maybe a few months just to hone her material. But definitely that next generation, as you and Sarah are bringing up, are are here with us. And so I wanted to close with the words from dear Sam Ozer, one of the beloved young people in our community whose life was tragically cut short just days ago. Sid and Mindy's son at age 17 in a bike and car accident. And as I went back with some heartbreak in preparation for his funeral and to find his bar mitzvah folder, since he and I had worked together on that, I wanted to see what he had written in his Devar Torah. And in his Devar Torah, Sam, as a pronounced scientist and a rationalist, though he had begun to explore in the last year of his life with his girlfriend Lily matters of spiritual nature as well, though I personally don't see those as separate categories, just to be on the record for that. And Sam, particularly in the Parsha Breshit, at the beginning of Genesis, was drawn to that line, let us make human beings in our own image. First of all, the plurality in the Hebrew. It doesn't say, let me make human beings. Who's the us? The diversity is baked into divinity in the first lines, of the Torah that way. And he said, I feel that is true, that we are born equal in potential, but we are not all born equal in our situations. And so how can we possibly say that if we don't do anything about it? And he talked about his dyslexia and the things he needed to overcome, but that how in poorer areas of Philadelphia, particularly for Black male kids, that the absence of diagnosis and the lack of resources contributed to that inequality, whether there was a special need or just in life as well, and what we were going to do about that. So Sam, again, so sadly is not here to continue that in his own life, but in his own death, his words ring powerfully for us, and the way people have been organizing in his memory and contributing to various causes, some of which we've talked about today, also gives me hope in this moment. And I'll give the last word to Ellen/Abby. With love and appreciation for your presence and wisdom, David, I find hope and inspiration in listening and learning and sharing and acting for the good and justice communally. Ken Yehi Ratzon, let it be, let it be. So hopefully you've lunched or will lunch. Hopefully you live a little bit more passionately as a result of these conversations. And I pray that each of us has learned a little bit of something. So Mincha Tov, have a wonderful rest of the day. Love you all. It's so great to see such a wonderful turnout here. We may start a cafe or maybe align ourselves with Grubhub so we make deliveries during the conversation. We'll see where this all evolves to. But for now, Mincha Tov and be well.